Hello, I'm Bill Clark and I'm an indie game designer. I'm here today to share some thoughts about how to design boss fights. I love a good boss fight. They can be the highest moment of the entire game if executed well. They can also bring the game to a screeching halt if made without the right principles. So let's dig in. Almost always, a boss fight is a series of skill tests. But what skills should be tested? Here's what I like to think of as the golden rule of boss design. The skills to beat a boss should be selected from the skills the game has required to reach the boss. There are two ways that this rule can be broken. The first is to require skills that aren't relative to the game at all. So if you make a platformer, then require the player to do some shooting or aiming, then that breaks the golden rule. More subtle are cases where the game allows the player to use skills if they would like, and then the boss requires you to use those skills. This is present in Deus Ex Human Revolution, where you are required to use straightforward guns and explosive combat, even if your character has literally never killed an enemy prior to that. Why is the golden rule important? Well, you don't know very much about an arbitrary player of your game. You don't know what other games they like, you don't know what they're good at, you don't know what their strengths and weaknesses are as a gamer or as a human. The only thing you know, when they reach a boss, is that they've done the things that you require them to do before reaching that boss. So any other skill you assume they have because, quote, all gamers know how to do something, there will be some players who don't. There will be some players who can't. And there will be some players who can, but didn't want to, which is why they chose to do a pacifist stealth run of Deus Ex Human Revolution. So, you're making your boss fight, and you've chosen a few of the game's core skills to test. Those skills may be timing, platforming, aiming, answering riddles, looking up information in an almanac, or combining atoms into complicated chemicals. Now you need to construct your tests. There are 4 axes that I use to measure boss fights. Those axes are complexity, precision, severity, and endurance. Any boss will have different ratings for the 4 axes, and those differences are a big part of what makes bosses feel different and exciting relative to each other. To start, complexity is a measure of the action that the player is required to do. Many bosses on Enter the Gungeon require simple actions, namely shooting in the direction of the huge, slow-moving boss and dodging bullets. On the other end of the spectrum, many WoW raid bosses have mechanics that require half an hour of discussion and the coordinated actions of a few dozen players. A memorably complex fight is Razorgore, the first boss of Blackwing Lair. Every member of the 40-player raid had a different, specific job to be carried out, and any one of those jobs failing could lead to a raid wipe. Precision describes how much flexibility there is on the exact way the player executes the action. Often this has to do with timing windows or spaces that the player needs to move into. The Mother Brain on Super Metroid notably does everything in her power to not require precision. She moves her head into a space where you can stand still, hold the R button, and shoot at any time for a guaranteed hit. Or you can jump straight up and shoot forward. By making it trivial to hit her, Samus's overwhelming power, granted by her adopted Metroid, is emphasized. The most precision-oriented fight I can think of is Jinsuke Sase in Sekiro Shadows Die Twice. This mini-boss does one main move, a Yaijutsu blade draw that strikes twice. The player is given a split second of warning, then must parry twice with exact timing. If they succeed, Sase's posture is heavily damaged. If their timing is off, the player instead takes heavy damage. Severity is a measure of the consequences of failing one of the tests. A hallmark of From Software games, including Sekiro, is extremely high severity. If you mess up Sase's double parry, you lose a little more than half your life. If you're quick, you can get a healing gourd down before the next attack, but sometimes you'll just straight up lose the fight. Low severity is particularly useful for puzzle-style boss fights. For example, when I designed the Wraith King boss fight for Dota 2's Wraith Knight game mode in winter 2013, I knew that players had spent a long time to get to the boss. I wanted to give players plenty of room to explore the boss fight without needing to go rerun the whole mode. So each of his moves, even in his final phase, cannot kill a player directly. And there's plenty of time to move away and heal if you're able to dodge even some of the heavily telegraphed attacks. Endurance measures how long the player must continue to pass tests in order to beat the boss. To continue with Jinsuke Saze, which is one of my favorite bosses of all time, the fight can be beaten in around 30 seconds. If you precisely parry every double strike and jump counter every sweep, he drops very quickly. This is appropriate for the extreme precision and severity. Expecting the player to maintain their precision for very long would be extremely frustrating, and also out of touch with the physiological reality of stress and focus. Mutoid Man in Smash TV represents a classic bullet sponge boss, taking 5+ minutes of power-up scavenging and shooting. And don't even get me started on JRPG bosses, which can often take an hour or more to painstakingly whittle down. So to review, your boss's skill tests can be measured by where they fall on complexity, precision, severity, and endurance. There's no such thing as a correct set of ratings. You need to decide what the desired player experience is, which will then yield appropriate ratings. To review some of the fights we've discussed so far. Razorgore was a test to make sure that players are ready for Blackwing Lair, which was a big step up from Molten Core. He indexed very heavily on complexity and severity to make sure that the raid group was on their A game as far as communication, with few, if any, weak links. Mother Brain is a story boss, not a gameplay boss. Ridley is the hardest boss fight, while Mother Brain is simply a tool to convey the tragic story of the last Metroid's relationship with Samus. So she is a low complexity, low precision, zero severity fight. Jinsuke Saze is an extremely high stress boss fight, but he is not meant to be a major focus of attention, hence the low endurance, and the save point literally right outside of his door. I wanted Wraith King to feel like a climax, and players to feel proud for beating him. But as I mentioned, I didn't want many players to fail upon reaching him. Thus I raised complexity, with multiple types of ads to deal with, including tombstones hidden around the map in places you haven't been before, and relatively high endurance, but low precision and severity to give lots of room for experimentation and safe failure. There are reasons that hour-long JRPG boss fights are so common. First, these games tend to already be fairly slow in pace, so a long boss fight isn't that surprising. Second, JRPG mechanics often don't allow for fun precision or severity. They tend to take the form of one-hit kills, which are their own form of frustrating. Thus, in order to make a boss feel epic and significant, making them into a cinematic endurance test is a fairly straightforward way to make the boss stand out. Now let's apply these measures to one more boss fight that I love. The final boss of Sekiro is Sword Saint Isshin Ashina. Isshin is a legendary swordsman whose youth is restored by his grandson sacrificing his life. Throughout the rest of the game, Sekiro faces fighters who studied Isshin's style, as well as members of clans from whom Isshin in turn had learned. Thus, the lore calls for Isshin to be the master of every technique the player has yet contended with. This is a perfect setup for the final boss of a very boss-focused game. If the player has passed quizzes and tests throughout the game, the time has now come for the final exam, which reviews all of the material. The responses to each move that Isshin wields are as complex as Sekiro supports. Jumps, step counters, parries, dodges, and even the weird lightning counter move are expected to be used as appropriate. The player is given a subtle shift in Isshin's posture and possibly an audio cue, and they must then summon up one of a half a dozen completely different timing plus button press plus spatial position combos. Over the course of 3 phases, Isshin's moveset slowly shifts. The precision required is at its peak in the first phase, with several combos that rival Jinsuke Saze, though tuned to be slightly more forgiving on timing. Phase 2 and 3, while they drop the precision slightly, raise the severity, making it more likely the failed counter will lead to a failed encounter. Relative to other bosses in the game, Isshin is a much longer fight than most. This is required to give time for him to demonstrate his full moveset, and require the player to pass most of the different tests successfully. This endurance test is grueling. When I was working on beating him, I had to step away from the game a couple of times to rest and recover. It's worth noting that Isshin's severity and precision are not the highest for any boss in the game. If they were, I would argue that he would have been mistuned. The boss is focused on complexity and endurance. The severity and precision are then tuned to be as high as they reasonably could, while still allowing a player who has made it this far to work their way through him. Thanks for watching this video. I'd love to hear your thoughts about your favorite boss fights, particularly if they either stretch or break the model I presented here. Links are down below to come find me, or to play my latest game, Craft Defense, which is notably lacking in boss fights. Talk to you soon.